Hello. We all think we know Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza or Benedict de Spinoza, but do we really? The thing about this man is he was the living embodiment of what he preached. Everything that he preached, which was operating from reason, was how he lived. So why was he a man born out of his time? Well, in the time he was born, which was 1632, there was a huge amount of religious, what I can only call chaos going on. Lots of different religious factions were vying for dominance, Protestant and Catholic and other religions who didn't really get a look in. Anyway, he was one of the religions that didn't really get a look in because he was a Sephardic Jew. The Sephardic Jews were ejected from Spain and Portugal, where they lived quite nicely, and then eventually they were ejected from Portugal too. Either that or they have to change their names to some animal name. So if you hear someone's surname in Portugal is Coelho, which means rabbit, you know that their ancestry is Jewish. Anyway, they had to convert or they had to leave. So Spinoza's family chose to leave. They went to Amsterdam, where the Jews were welcomed, which is why Amsterdam is such a big, rich centre for gold at the moment. And that's the legacy from the Jews that moved there, because that was their main occupation, if you like, amongst others. Of course, I'm just generalising. So that's his native heritage. He was born to a guy called Michael Spinoza, who was a merchant, and the family was part of the vibrant Jewish community in Amsterdam. They were a very important people, if you like. Anyway, so he got his traditional Jewish education, which is quite valuable even today. He studied Hebrew, the Torah, the Talmud, but he also was interested in secular subjects like Latin, mathematics, and the emerging scientific ideas of that time. He was influenced by people like Descartes and Hobbes. And little aside here, with his Latin learning, he was keen on his Latin teacher's daughter, and I think she was about 13 at the time. Her name was Clara Maria van der Eden. She was the daughter of Franciscus van der Eden, who was a Jesuit radical thinker. When he was in his late teens, he met her and he became what can only be said as infatuated with her. She spurned him for another guy called, let me think, I'm trying to remember the name. I think it's Dirk Kerkritten, something like that. Anyway, she spurned him for him, and he kind of never got over it. She married the guy, but she didn't marry Spinoza. Well, that's his love life. I mean, it wasn't very successful, but I think he found something far more exciting than to fall in love. Anyway, on to who was Spinoza and why he was a man out of his time. Both his ethics and his treatise were published after he died. Now, this is probably partly, and this is me imagining, it's probably partly because he was thinking some very radical thoughts, and it could get him into a lot of trouble. Ultimately he could have got killed for it. So he was very cautious. Anyway, let's go on to who he was as a person. So as a person, He was very independent. He didn't follow the rules, which I love. I love somebody who's a little bit free in their thinking. Anyway, so he didn't follow the rules. He was a Jew, but at the age of, I think it was 24, he got excommunicated. As a young man, Spinoza showed his intellectual independence, and that put him at odds with religious authorities. By his early 20s, his questioning of traditional Jewish doctrines such as the divine origin of the Torah and the immortality of the soul led to conflict with the synagogue. In 1656, when he was 23, he was excommunicated, issued a cherem from the Jewish community for his heretical views. We'll never know exactly why, but I think it was a little bit difficult for them to reconcile themselves with his anthropomorphic rejection of God. He embraced rational inquiry, and that's probably played a role in his excommunication, because he didn't follow the doctrine. He didn't think that God was this man in a white robe that came down and issued all these dictates. Anyway, this expulsion isolated him from his community and his family, but it actually freed him to pursue his philosophical work. So where does the name Benedictus come in? Well, after he was excommunicated, he changed his name to Benedictus instead of Baruch. After his excommunication, Spinoza adopted the Latinized version of his name, Benedictus, which means blessed, and he lived a modest, almost ascetic life. He earned a living as a lens grinder, which we'll go into later, crafting high-quality lenses for microscopes and telescopes. This was a trade that reflected his fascination with science and precision. I mean, nowadays, he would probably be doing something very similar. For example, an optical technician or an ophthalmic laboratory technician, where the roles involve fabricating, grinding, polishing and assembling lenses. Let's just put you into the perspective here. We're looking at somebody who was fairly well qualified in his field, that he had skills that were very valuable at the time, especially amongst the scientific community. And although he had these skills, they weren't particularly financially rewarding. He would earn about the equivalent of 45,000 a year doing this. While it's a skilled trade, it's certainly not the CEO of a company or something like that. So he was earning quite a nice living for a single man, which was fine. It probably wouldn't have suited a family man, but his efforts went towards his understanding and his philosophy rather than towards raising a family. So as a skilled artisan, he would have lived quite a frugal life in the Dutch Republic. Nice enough, but certainly no luxury. So Spinoza would spend his day lens grinding. 5 days a week, during the day he would lens grind. But outside of that, he enjoyed walking, and also he liked to sketch. So he studied philosophy and came up with his own ideas. He did lots of sketching. Sadly, we don't have any of them left, so they've all disappeared somewhere. They were probably of himself, of other people, of abstract ideas and thoughts that he had. There were obviously no masterpieces, but they were useful in him honing his understanding, and his walks were useful for him to reflect. So go out for a nice walk. Of course, he lived in 3 main places after Amsterdam. I've cut this description of Spinoza's life into two parts, the second of which will be coming soon.